Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com, dwyervip.com. Look us up in the sports section on Roku. We're there. The vanity code to add it is Dwyer Boxing News, one word. The name of that channel is Dwyer Boxing and Sports News. On iTunes, the vanity code is one word, Dwyer Boxing News. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Well, several months ago, I made a video here online. I think I entitled it, What If Billy Joe Saunders versus Chris Eubank? Now, both fighters were unbeaten. But, more beer for us, as expected, Billy Joe Saunders closed the deal and beat Chris Eubank by, in my opinion, a wider margin than the scorecards. Right? Let me say this. I know there was a lot of talk about Chris Eubank giving Carl Froch a hard time in training. But understand, whatever time Chris Eubank gave Carl Froch in training didn't give Eubank a jab or a developed outside game. You've heard me here online talk about fighters who don't have an inside game. Here you have the reverse. You have a guy who simply didn't have enough of an outside game to deal with a much more experienced opponent in Billy Joe Saunders. Right? Understand, Eubank really couldn't jab his way in. Eubank really couldn't play chess with Saunders from the outside. Right? So when the guys are far apart, when they're looking at each other and there's a few feet between them, this fight is a mismatch. Right? I believe the illusion that went into this fight was the fact that Eubank is the son of a fighter who had a lot of skills. Right? But boxing's not about who you know or who you're related to. Right? Senior, all he could do was watch the fight from the corner. Right? He couldn't go out there and actually help Junior in the ring. And let me just say, Junior was blowing out lesser opposition. Right? Billy Joe Saunders isn't lesser opposition. In fact, let me say this. Whoever decided to have Eubank fight a slick southpaw at this stage of his development, right? A slick southpaw who has a jab, who has boxing ability from the outside, and who has defensive ability on the inside, right? Whoever told Eubank that this was a great fight for him at this stage of his career gave him astonishingly bad advice. Right? The first few rounds, I thought Saunders swept them. I thought Eubank couldn't figure out Saunders' left-handed stance. I don't think he ever figured out how to deal with Saunders' jab. Right? When Billy Joe Saunders has a full tank of gas, he's winning every round. Right? The fight doesn't even become, in my opinion, and I understand the judges disagree with me, what else is new? But the fight doesn't even come competitive until, let's say, the 5th or 6th rounds. Now, at that stage, Eubank is really in the deep end of the pool because he's already lost at least the first 4 rounds. Right? He's already behind by 4 rounds. Let's say we give Eubank one of the first 4 rounds. He's behind by at least a couple rounds. Right? Against a guy who's a better outside fighter than he is. Right? In other words, Eubank, by the middle of this fight, needs something big to happen. Right? He needs to knock down Billy Joe Saunders. He needs to badly hurt Billy Joe Saunders. He needs to do something to break the rhythm of the fight, because the way the fight's going, is it's low volume. Saunders is there popping a jab. Saunders also has the better timing before a punch. In other words, Saunders is moving, right? He's feinting. You don't know when the punch is going to come. And let's just say Eubank, at this stage of his career, is so green, he stayed outside. He didn't have enough of a bounce to get inside. Let me go further. When he gets inside, right, it's not like he has a great big-time body attack. Seems to me he's really focused on throwing uppercuts inside. Early on, you get the feeling that Eubank's only chance of winning the fight is by KO. And the problem is when he gets inside on Saunders, Saunders is actually able to smother him. Saunders does get hit with way too many uppercuts, but Saunders actually leans on him. Look where Saunders' head is in the later rounds. It's right here. It's right here on Eubank. Right? Eubank can't really handle the fact that Saunders, the better outside fighter, can smother him defensively inside. Right? And, as you watch Eubank, and Eubank's wearing all black, like Mike Tyson back in the day, you actually gain a greater appreciation of Mike Tyson. And guys like that who could take a step back and could hit you with an uppercut. In other words, guys are trying to smother a guy looking to land uppercuts. There's a skill to landing an uppercut inside. Let's say Eubank looks tied up. In fact, Eubank at times looks confused. He even briefly hits the canvas. It's a slip in the 11th round. But you just don't get the feeling that Eubank is dominant inside. He's certainly outgunned outside. This is a case really of too much too soon, right? Too many reports of Eubank looking good in the gym against a Carl Froch. Understand, a Carl Froch might have reached the conclusion that he's better than Eubank on the outside and might have really focused his training on just dealing with Eubank inside and just coming up with ways to block a guy's uppercut inside. The fact that Eubank had inspired moments against Carl Froch in training, again, doesn't mean that he would have inspired moments against Carl Froch in a real fight, nor does it give him the tools to fight a superior outside fighter, Billy Joe Saunders, right? Who's a southpaw, unlike Carl Froch, in a real match, right? Unless, of course, Carl Froch and Eubank, during their sparring sessions, are actually focused on outside punching, which they may not have been. Let me say this too. Saunders doesn't have a big punch, right? Both of these guys seem to have stamina problems to me, right? But Saunders is so much more advanced that you'll notice at times Saunders, who's a southpaw, is leading with his left hand. He's able to come in and land power shots, right? In other words, the framing of his punches are much better than Eubank's, right? Eubanks is looking at him. He's moving and feinting before he throws punches. So you don't know when the punch is coming. Then you don't know which hand he's going to throw. He has a pretty good right jab, but then he could pop you with his power hand straight. Even when Saunders is hurt in this fight, right? There are a few times where he is hurt in the second half of the fight. You'll notice Saunders is savvy enough to turn Eubank. In other words, Eubank can't just hurt him and then set up shop in front of him, because Saunders, when he's hurt, turns. So Eubank has to reset, right? Saunders is actually able to buy time even when he doesn't have the legs to back away from the action, right? So put me among those who actually didn't think the fight was that close. I'm surprised that this was a split decision. The judges must have been the same judges who watched Tony Bellew against Nathan Cleverly, because how do you get a split decision on this fight? I'm even more surprised that Chris Eubank thinks he won the fight. Feels that he closed the show in such a way, in a fight that had no knockdowns. Right? In a fight where, let me say this, I thought Saunders won the 9th round. Isn't the second half of the fight supposed to be Eubank's best moments? Right? I thought Saunders won the 9th round. On my scorecard, Saunders won the 10th round. In other words, on my scorecard, Saunders wins at least half of the last third of the fight when Eubanks is supposed to be making this big comeback. Also, when you look back on the last half of that fight, now it's clear Saunders dominates the first half of the fight. The last half of the fight, look at how tired Eubank is. Right? Eubank has to take portions of the rounds off. Right? Stamina is really a concern for both fighters. I can't look at the last third of this fight and reach the conclusion that Eubank had more stamina than Saunders. Right? In fact, in the 9th round, Eubank is so tired that he misses some punches by wide margins. And Saunders is able to counter him, which Saunders does well. Right? In the 8th round, there's a moment in the 8th round, and the 8th round is one of Eubank's better rounds, where even the announcer had to say on the telecast that it looked like Eubank had to take his foot off the gas. Because simply put, Eubank doesn't have enough stamina left to just come out and dominate a round from start to finish. Right? So I thought this is too much too soon. I think Eubank needs to develop really more of an outside game. He's not the huge puncher that his father was. Right? He doesn't have the charisma from the outside that his father had in terms of posing and walking around the ring to kind of hide the fact that he's not landing a lot of shots from the outside. Right? If Billy Joe Saunders had a little bit more stamina and was just a little bit more focused defensively on Chris Eubank's uppercut, he could have stayed on his back foot the entire fight and made this look even easier. As it was, I thought Saunders won this fight by a few rounds. Right? Not 2 rounds. I thought Saunders wins the fight by at least 3 or 4 rounds. I view this fight really more as a 8-4 fight in terms of rounds. Right? I certainly thought Saunders dominated early. I thought the last third of the fight was really a draw. Right? I didn't really see Eubank landing the kind of dramatic punches where I would reach the conclusion that he owned the second half of the fight. Right? Saunders is more advanced than Eubank at this point. Eubank strikes me as a guy who needs to get inside and needs to overwhelm an opponent with uppercuts. Right? Eubank also isn't the committed body puncher that he needs to be to wear down an opponent. Right? Look at the early rounds. If Eubanks' best shot in this fight is to land some big sledgehammer type uppercut, then why isn't he trying to put in work, even if he's losing the early rounds, by getting on his front foot, lowering his head, and at least digging several hooks to Saunders' body? Shouldn't Eubanks have been pushing the action, even if he's losing the rounds, so that later in the fight, Saunders, the better boxer, is debilitated, runs out of stamina, and then is vulnerable to the big shots? But Eubank doesn't bank the body work early. So what you have is Saunders, in my opinion, getting out to a big lead, and then both guys being tired later in the fight, with Saunders taking, in my opinion, the 9th and 10th rounds. Take even a close look at the 8th round. right? Eubank lands some big shots, but takes his foot off the gas. Saunders gets back in that round. Right? I mean, let me also point out, too, that Eubank's on his front foot late in this fight. What I want you to do is to actually look at whether the big punches are landing. It looks to me like Saunders has his hands inside of Eubank. It seems to me like a lot of what Eubank is throwing is hitting Saunders' forearms. It looks to me like Saunders is moving and is taking the sting out of much of what Chris Eubank is throwing. In other words, you see the movement from Eubank. I saw more movement than landed punches. I thought Saunders won this fight. I think Chris Eubank has to work on his outside game, his pacing, his body shots, right? And what to do when an opponent smothers him inside defensively. Let me hear from you. Leave your comments for me here online. Visit us at gamblersadvisory.com. I understand that this was officially a split decision. I understand that the scorecards were close. If you feel I'm being unfair here to Chris Eubank, tell us why in the comment section to this video. Thanks for stopping by.